This next unit of the class is going to focus on the French philosopher René Descartes. In this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a kind of very brief biographical sketch of Descartes. And then I'm going to spend more time talking about the kind of historical context and what happens between Descartes and Aristotle. There's a large gap of time here. Descartes lived from 1596 to 1650. Aristotle dies in the 300s BC. There's nearly 1900 years in between them. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on, at least what's important for our purposes in that stretch of time. And one of the reasons I'm going to focus on this is because it's very difficult to understand Descartes' project, what he's doing and why, without understanding some of what was happening in that 1900 years, without understanding the kind of historical background to his project. And so that's what I'm going to focus on in this video. But very quickly, a couple words about Descartes. So Descartes was a scientist, mathematician, and philosopher. He wrote on all these areas of whatever learning. He came from what we would probably call a kind of middle-class family. His father wanted him to go into law, and that's what he was going to do, but then he decided he didn't really like it. And he devotes himself to learning, to science. He becomes very, very interested in science. He goes to one of the best schools of the day in Europe called La Flèche, which was run by the Jesuits. There you go. And it's at that school that his interest in science really kind of takes off. And so instead of going into law, instead of following the wishes of his father, he becomes interested in science, mathematics, and philosophy. His major works are these. He starts off writing about science for quite a bit of time. So The World, The Treatise of Man, The Optics of Meteorology, these are all entirely scientific works. The Treatise of Man, that might sound like it's kind of philosophical or whatever. It's not really. What he's writing about, I mean, it has philosophical implications, but what it's about is not, it's about how the body works. It's more a work on anatomy or physiology. And he lays out this view according to which the human body is a kind of machine with pulleys and levers and so on, and that's how arms move and everything else, right? It's this kind of machine, just like something constructed out of pulleys and levers and so on. We're going to return to this a little bit later, or some of the implications of this idea, how it gets incorporated into his philosophical view of the human person later. That's why I mention it now. But the Treatise of Man isn't really even philosophical yet. It's really, a work on physiology, something like that, how the body works. The optics, of course, is going to be about light. The meteorology and the world, those are going to be concerned with kind of cosmological issues, how the solar system works. This is before Newton, Descartes was, and so they didn't have this notion of gravity. They didn't know about gravity, and so they had to try to, how is this working? How are the planets going in these circles? Why do they stay in these orbits and so on? Descartes gives an account of this in those works, right? So he's kind of writing these scientific works, and then he begins to write on mathematics. And if you've heard Descartes' name before, it's likely because of this work from 1637 called the Geometry. This work is one of the most important works in the history of mathematics, period. Descartes makes one of the most important contributions to mathematics that a human being has ever made. What Descartes does in the Geometry is he discovers a way of synthesizing algebra and geometry, of taking algebraic equations and modeling them into geometrical figures. No one had ever done this prior to Descartes. No one had thought of this. It required a certain kind of creativity, which Descartes had. Descartes invented the coordinate plane system, or he discovered it, right? That's why, if you've heard of Descartes before, it might be because of the Cartesian coordinate system, the Cartesian coordinate plane, or the Cartesian plane, something like that. Cartesian, it's after Descartes, right? And the Cartesian coordinate system is just a XY grid, right? With 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the negatives. Descartes was the first person to realize that you could take an algebraic equation, say something like y equals 2x minus 3, and make a line out of it, represent it with a line, with a geometrical shape. Now, this just seems obvious to us because we've taken algebra, we've taken geometry. But Descartes was the first person to see this, right? And you can get much more complicated than just mere lines. You can do circles. What is that? X squared plus y squared equals some number, something like that. You can do whatever, curves, and right, you can go nuts with it, right? Descartes was the one who figured that out. And so one of his most important contributions in intellectual history is this right here. But after his foray into mathematics, he devotes himself to philosophy. So the discourse on method, the meditations on first philosophy, and the principles of philosophy. And this is really what occupies him in the latter part of his writing career until the end of his life. He becomes much more interested in these philosophical questions. One of the things that we're going to try to understand, we're going to start seeing today is, well, why does that happen? Why does he kind of leave science and math and start doing all this philosophy stuff? Principles of Philosophy is like a textbook he wrote that people could use, something like that. The Discourse on Method is kind of his first foray into philosophy. The Meditations on First Philosophy, which people just call the Meditations, that's his magnum opus. That's his greatest work of philosophy. That's what everybody reads in philosophy, and that's what we're reading. That's his most mature, greatest, most interesting exposition of his views. And so that's what we're going to look at. What is going on in these meditations on first philosophy? Now, to understand why he starts writing on philosophy and to understand what's going on in the meditations, we need to understand, like I was saying, a bit about the history, what's going on in between Descartes and Aristotle. And to see why we need to understand this history, the first line of the Meditations is helpful. So, the very first line of the Meditations, some years ago, I was struck by how many false things I had believed. Right? This is Descartes talking in the first person. I, Descartes. And by how doubtful was the structure of beliefs that I had based on them. Now, you might read that and think, oh, okay, that's fine and good and great. And okay, fine. Yeah, well, we've all believed false things and you got to think, and then maybe you'll come to believe true ones or whatever. But what I'm going to try to show you in the remainder of this video is that this is no idle boast, that Descartes is dead serious about this. And he means, right, not just, oh, yeah, geez, I was wrong. I used to think, I don't know. I used to think Santa Claus existed. Now I know he doesn't, or what. Not like that. So many of his beliefs, he's going to say, he found were just false. They turned out to be just absolutely false. Some of his most foundational beliefs about how the world worked and operated. Now, to see this, to understand why he would say something like this, we need to look at this history between Aristotle and Descartes. And so here's a timeline. You can see Plato and Aristotle way over there on the left in the 400s BC, and Descartes over there on the right, some 1800 years later. What's going on in this middle period? What I want to do right now is trace the kind of history of philosophy very quickly. We're not going to go into it in any kind of detail, but the major philosophical schools or happenings that occur, that are active within this 18 to 1900 year period. So immediately after Aristotle, there's this kind of burgeoning of philosophy within the ancient Greek world. And as ancient Greece recedes and ancient Rome is on the rise, that kind of burgeoning of philosophy just it doesn't go away with ancient Greece. Rather, it's just transferred to the ancient Roman world, and the ancient Romans kind of pick up the mantle. There are three main, and this period of philosophy, so immediately kind of after Aristotle and then into the 1 to 200s or so, people refer to as Hellenistic philosophy. Hellenistic is really just another way of saying Greek. The ancient Greeks didn't call Greece Greece; they called it Hellas. And so Hellenistic philosophy really just kind of means Greek philosophy, but it refers not to Plato and Aristotle and not to anything before them, but what comes after them. And there are three main schools within Hellenistic philosophy. There's Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Skepticism. You may have heard the word Stoic. Oh, he's being very stoic. He's not showing any emotion at all or whatever. That comes from this school. The Stoics claim that you shouldn't feel any emotions. They meant something very specific by it. It doesn't work. It doesn't matter. We're not going to get into it. But the Stoics were highly influenced by Aristotle and Plato. They also disagreed with them in certain ways. The skeptics seem to have been influenced by some things that Socrates had said. They took Socrates to be a kind of skeptic. The Epicureans, they thought the good was pleasure, and so they disagreed with Plato and Aristotle fairly directly. Anyways, you have this burgeoning of schools, and you also had followers of Aristotle and Plato running around too. Right. So, and so some big figures you may have heard of Cicero, right? There's the road in the little city in Chicago named after Cicero. He was a Roman senator and philosopher. We have a bunch of his works. He was kind of into the Stoic and skeptical schools of Hellenistic philosophy. After Hellenistic philosophy, the next phase people call Neoplatonism. It's this kind of revival of Plato's philosophy. And there's along with this, so Plato's Academy is shut down. I can't remember when exactly. Sometime it goes on for a few hundred years after Plato, but then it's shut down. It's reopened by the Neoplatonists, or they attempt to kind of refound Plato's Academy, something like that. The major figures here are Plotinus, Proclus, and Pseudo-Dionysius. You may have heard of them, probably not as commonly known as something like Stoicism. But this is really just a revival of Plato and also Aristotle. They like Aristotle too. They think Aristotle's kind of a Platonist. And so it's this revival of the Platonic way of viewing things. And this kind of takes over the philosophical scene. In this period, you find the great Christian theologian, philosopher, St. Augustine. He was well-versed in Platonism. He knew about these people. And he, in certain ways, was responding to them and taking up various things that they said. One way that people, this is a generalization, but one way that people think about Augustine is that what he was trying to do was show a kind of harmony between Platonism or Neoplatonism and Christianity. Pseudo-Dionysius was doing the same thing. Pseudo-Dionysius was also a Christian. Why his name was Pseudo-Dionysius, I'll leave that as a mystery. You can go look it up. Anyways, right? Who would name their kid Pseudo? He wasn't named that. So you have Augustine kind of responding to these philosophical schools, these Neoplatonists. Then what happens is we enter into what people now call the Dark Ages, right? Rome falls around 500 or so. And the European world kind of goes into a period of decline with regard to advanced learning, science, math, philosophy, theology, and so on. Goes into a decline with regard to furthering the life of the mind, furthering the sciences, and so on. It, however, does not just disappear from the face of the earth. The cutting edge of learning, rather, is kind of finds its way over to the Islamic world. And so we have this period of time Um, uh, People, I think, cite the founding as there's the founding of this, what they called House of Wisdom or School of Wisdom. I can't remember what it's called exactly, in Baghdad. I think a generation or two after Muhammad and the kind of founding, if you will, of Islam. Um, the cutting edge of learning, of science, of math, of philosophy, of theology, is found in the Islamic world among philosophers such as Avicenna, Al-Farabi, Al-Ghazali, and Averroes. And what these people do is they they kind of inherited Plato and Aristotle from the European world. They have those texts, the texts of Plato and Aristotle. Those texts, not all of them, but a lot of them, kind of go out of print, so to speak, in the European world. The people in the European world don't have access to them anymore. They don't have copies of them. All of the copies, the people who are still reading them and commenting on them and thinking about them, they're all these philosophers in the Islamic world. And there are numerous advancements to kind of higher learning that occur during this period. Perhaps the most notable is a mathematical advancement. It's within the Islamic Golden Age that you get the founding of, or the discovery of, algebra. Algebra is an Arabic word. So that occurs during this period, right? So, but it's still highly informed by Plato and Aristotle. Hellenistic philosophy is, Neoplatonism is, Islamic philosophy, classical Islamic philosophy, someone like Avicenna or Averroes, highly influenced by Plato and Aristotle. Indeed, they would be self-described Aristotelians and Platonists. Overlapping with, but also kind of going later than the Islamic Golden Age, is what people refer to as medieval scholasticism. And this is really what people have in mind when they talk about medieval philosophy, which is, you can take a class in medieval philosophy if you like here at Loyola. It's referring to this period of time and these philosophers, the most notable of whom are Saint Anselm, who is actually influential on Descartes in certain ways. We're not going to look at it in any kind of detail, really, though. St. Thomas Aquinas, who about a zillion high schools are named after, and I don't know, maybe 5, 10 colleges and universities, right? And then a guy named John Duns Scotus. He was also active during this period. You may have also heard of Occam's razor. William of Occam is who that's named after. He was right on the tail end of this school of philosophy. The medieval scholastics were highly influenced by people like Averroes and Avicenna, by the Islamic philosophers. They take up their mantle. And so someone like Aquinas is a thoroughgoing Aristotelian. He's still within the Aristotelian Platonistic school or tradition of philosophy. Aquinas was reading Pseudo-Dionysius. He was reading Aristotle. He was reading Averroes and talking about them, trying to develop their ideas. And so what I want to emphasize at this point is this entire history of philosophy up until right around the time of Descartes is thoroughly Aristotelian. Aristotle sets the kind of paradigm, Aristotle and Plato, kind of set the paradigm in which all learning and all science, all philosophy and theology operates, right? So this Aristotelian, Platonistic, intellectual paradigm reigns supreme, sets the terms of the debate for the next 1,800 years. Right? There's been no more successful intellectual paradigm than that instituted by Plato and Aristotle. Okay, so that brings us almost to the time of Descartes, right? So what we've seen, what's been going on in philosophy and learning more generally, science and everything else, is a kind of advancement upon Aristotle. To put, that's being a little bit overgeneral, a little bit too hand wavy about it, but that's basically what's been going on. All right. I want to highlight one feature of this Aristotelian view of the world that all of these philosophers and scientists and so on, starting from the time of Aristotle, going through medieval scholasticism, would have agreed with. It's part of Aristotle's legacy. And what I'm going to call it is this teleological view of the world. Teleological, that's not a real word, that's a made up word. It's not theological, right? That's not the word. The word is teleological. And it comes from the Greek word telos. And we've seen this word actually. Telos is the Greek word for end or goal or purpose. Telos, the telos of a thing, is its final cause. And so when I talk about Aristotle and the Neoplatonists and the scholastics and the Islamic philosophers having a teleological view of the world, what I mean is that they would think that the things in the world have a final cause. All the things in the world have a final cause. And that they think, and further, they would think that to understand anything within the world, you have to understand its final cause, its end, its goal, its purpose. And throughout that stretch of time between Aristotle and Descartes, that purpose comes to be seen more and more kind of theologically. So, certainly, this is the case within the Neoplatonists. Even the ones who weren't Christian, they had a very kind of theological understanding of things. All things, they thought, are ultimately geared towards God or this divine principle. This was obviously true in the Islamic world, and this was obviously true in the kind of Christian medieval world with people like Aquinas, and then in the Christian medieval world, but then Avicenna in the Islamic world. And so the ultimate final cause of all things was God. But they thought that you could in order to understand the frog, you ultimately have to understand its purpose, its final cause, the role it plays in in the larger world, and then ultimately how it's related and directed towards God. Everything in the natural world has a final cause, right? This is a teleological view of the world, right? And so to understand anything in the natural world, you have to understand its final cause. Straight out of Aristotle. Now, that applies not just to frogs, not just to human beings, right? So this applies very importantly to human beings for someone like Aristotle and for all these thinkers following him, because this is really where ethics comes in. Ethics is kind of concerned, and you can think of it this way, Aristotle didn't put it this way, but it's kind of concerned with the final cause of human beings. It's not just frogs and human beings that this teleological view of the world applies to. All of these thinkers from Aristotle on through the scholastics had or subscribed to, I should say, what people now call the doctrine of natural place. And the idea was something like this. As we've talked about previously with Aristotle, the basic material constituents of the world, earth, fire, air, and water, right? They didn't know about atoms and particles and so on, right? So they thought earth, fire, air, and water were the most basic elements that material things are composed of. Those things also have a telos, have a final cause. Not just the ultimate final cause, God or something like that, but a kind of more immediate one. In the same way that the frog's kind of immediate final cause is to live a frog life. Well, earth, fire, air, and water also have a somewhat immediate final cause. They have a purpose. Earth has a purpose, a goal. Well, what on earth could that be? What is the purpose of Earth? And they're not these people are not going to say, cultivate plants so plants can grow or something. No. That's something kind of external to the earth. That's not its internal purpose, so to speak. That's not something it internally does. It just kind of so happens to do that. The growing, that's really internal to the nature of the plant, not the earth. And so when we're looking for what the purpose of Earth is, we can't cite the kind of external effects that it has. We have to cite something about it itself that it itself in its own right does. And so what does that do? The idea is something like this. Pick up some earth. Yeah. And then move your hand. What does it do? Well, it goes down. Let's say I picked up some earth and I held it over a bucket of water, right? And I let it, I move my hand. Well, what Aristotle and everybody following him would say is, well, look, what is the earth doing? It's going first, it's going below all that air. All that air between that was between my hand and the bucket of water down here, the earth goes below it all. And then it hits the water. And it goes below the water too. And you know what? If I drop that air over a fire, it would go below the fire. Earth, its purpose, its goal is to be below fire, air, and water. And the purpose of water is to be above earth and below fire and air. And the purpose of air is to be above water and below fire. And the purpose of fire is to be above everything. That's why when you light a fire, right, the flames all shoot up. The flames are trying to get up above the air. Each of the four elements has a natural place. The natural place of earth is down below everything else. And the natural place of fire is up above everything else. And then water and air right in the middle there. This is the doctrine of natural place. And then they would explain, well, then why do logs float or whatever? Well, that's because logs aren't composed entirely of earth. There's some air in there too, or fire or something, and so blah, 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 right? They would try to explain everything else in that way, right? Okay. A fairly straightforward implication of the doctrine of natural place is geocentrism. That is to say, right, if the natural place of earth is down below everything else, well, then earth is at the center of the universe. It's below everything else, right? And they didn't think that the earth was flat. That's a myth perpetrated by kind of 19th century German academics, whatever. It doesn't really matter for our purposes. Nobody ever really thought that the earth was flat until like 2010. And then you started getting basketball players or whatever saying that the earth was flat. Aristotle, Aquinas, Avicenna, they all knew the earth was a globe, that it was round, right? Their view was that it was this round globe of earth, of the element earth, primarily, composed of earth. And that earth all kind of clung, it all fell to the center. And so the natural place of earth was at the center of the universe. And then water was around the earth, and then air, the atmosphere around that. And then you had fire out there, like the sun or whatever, right? They had different views of where the fire goes. Is the stars just fire? Are the stars a different kind of element? It doesn't matter for our purposes. Right. So Aristotle's view of the world, this is the important point, Aristotle's view of the world, this teleological view of the world, which everybody from Aristotle through the scholastics accepted, seems to straightforwardly imply geocentrism. Earth is at the center of the universe, and everything else, the stars and the sun and all the planets, revolve around it. Go back to this timeline now. Immediately following what's classified as the school of medieval scholasticism, we start seeing scientists pop up who are interested in the structure of the solar system, how the solar system works. So in 1543, Nicholas Copernicus, it's the year he dies. He didn't publish it while he was alive. So right after he dies, he publishes his main work on the solar system. Nicholas Copernicus very famously argued for a heliocentric model of the universe, one according to which the sun was at the center and the earth is revolving around the sun. You have Kepler arguing for something similar, and then perhaps even most famously, Galileo in 1632 publishes what's called the Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, something like that, in which he argues very forcefully and very strongly for a heliocentric model of the solar system. And he is able to verify or support this heliocentric model with advances in scientific measurement. They get telescopes. They invent telescopes right around this time. And so Galileo is able to point his telescope up at the moons of, I think it's Saturn, and see that there are phases on them. And that would only make sense within a heliocentric view and blah, 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 right? And so we get this kind of concerted attack on geocentrism. Geocentrism is false. That's what the scientific revolution showed. These astronomers, scientists, looking up at the sky, argued very forcefully and persuasively that geocentrism is false. Now, we learned this in high school, but now we can kind of see what more was at stake here. Because when they were arguing this, they weren't just arguing, yeah, all you backwards geocentrists. They understood themselves to be showing that the Aristotelian view of the universe was false. Why? Because the Aristotelian view of the universe quite straightforwardly implies geocentrism. And we can see now that geocentrism is false. And so that means that this teleological view of the world has to be false. And so they argued that means Aristotle, Platonism, false. But look, that's been the reigning intellectual paradigm for some 1900 years. And so when Descartes says some years ago, I was struck by how many false things I had believed, he means it. He was educated into this scholastic view of the world. That's the kind of education he would have received at La Flèche, at the Jesuit college he attended. He would have been educated into this Aristotelian paradigm. And so when he says, man, everything I believe was false, and like this whole structure of beliefs and everything I based on them, false, right? That's what he's referring to. And by and large, and so Descartes sees himself and his scientific works, this is true, are more part of the scientific revolution than they are, say, medieval scholasticism, right? He's allied himself with people like Galileo and Copernicus and Kepler. And part of the scientific revolution was not just, right, it wasn't limited simply to denying geocentrism. They emphatically, directly, and explicitly denied teleology. And so another scientist who you may have heard of, Francis Bacon, who was also around at this time, who was involved in the scientific revolution, who's most famous for laying out the kind of scientific method. If you read his works, well, his main work is called The New Organon. That's a direct attack on Aristotle. Certain Aristotle's scientific methodological works were called, in following Aristotle all through scholasticism, were called the Organon. And so when Francis Bacon writes the New Organon, what he's doing is he's trying to say, like, we need to replace what Aristotle is doing. We need a new Organon, a new scientific method. And in the New Organon, Francis Bacon directly attacks final causation. That's a ridiculous way of looking at things, he thinks. And the proponents of the scientific revolution, people like Descartes, totally reject final causality. We do not understand anything by appealing to its purpose. Never appeal to things' purposes. That is an illegitimate way of proceeding to appeal to a thing's purpose. That's an unscientific way of trying to understand a thing. Right? That's Descartes, that's Bacon, that's these proponents of the scientific revolution. And so what we're going to see now in Descartes is an attempt to give a radically different view of the universe, a radically different view than had been present for some, I mean, right? Aristotle, this teleological view, had been the guiding paradigm for some 18 or 1900 years. And so, in the very beginning of the first meditation, when Descartes talks about starting over, that's what he's referring to. And so, what we're going to see in the meditations is Descartes' attempt to give a new foundation for human knowledge.